I'll be speaking to you today about using visual methods in qualitative research. So I'll be drawing very heavily on what we did within the big picture, but I'll also broaden out to a couple of other methods. So there are many different kinds of visual methods that you can use in qualitative research. The photo-led interviews, Photovoice specifically, and participatory poster making, that was a feature of the big picture, and I'm going to give specific examples of how that was used. But just like there are so many different forms of art, there are so many different forms of visual methods. Another that we'll talk about today is mapping. So mapping aspects of the body in a research-driven way, often symbolic, mapping relationships of the participant to other important people in their life, mapping spaces as being perhaps welcoming or unwelcoming, safe or unsafe. You can also use collage techniques. You can use clay. That's quite popular as well, to sculpt things as either visual artifacts in and of themselves, or something to do to stimulate people to think about things. And so we've got an example here of a photograph taken from a community space in my present city of Brighton that was used in an interview to just kind of spark conversation. That was selected by the researcher, but they thought it might be significant to a lot of people who frequent that space. There's another example of body mapping, which we'll come back to, in which somebody who was a migrant used visual language and metaphor and symbolism to talk about their migration journey and settlement journey, the complexities of that. So let me start by speaking particularly about photo elicitation, specifically Photovoice, and how we used it. And as was mentioned earlier, Photovoice specifically is a technique where people select their own pictures as part of the discussion, research encounter. So as mentioned, we conducted Photovoice interviews. I'm going to present examples from people who are in recovery from at least 1 year. And so therefore, these people who are considered actively in addiction previously, they're now considered to be in recovery, although certainly that's not a complete journey. They were invited to bring photographs, their own or found photographs and images, to interview as prompts to convey their experiences of risk, resilience, and recovery. And some examples here of images that a female participant brought. And you can see immediately that this brings a sense of personhood and immediacy and vividness to speaking about addiction and recovery. We're no longer speaking about general trends and general complexities and treatment options and laws. We're speaking about somebody's lived experience, and they've given us some insight into what that was like for them, some things that we might contemplate ourselves as researchers and as people who are lucky enough to view these images. We see that this person who's goes by the pseudonym of Daisy, she starts speaking about her addiction journey as something that started in childhood. Many people brought in childhood images, whether photographs or kind of images that spoke to childhood. She's bringing in something about being a girl with other girls in a school setting and kind of the excitement of being with other girls. There's an image of train tracks, which interestingly was something that recurred amongst many participants. A lot of them talked about trains or brought in images of trains and train stations, partly because these can be sites of using, but also the symbolism of going places and having choices and all things that trains can bring up. And there's an image here of a pregnant person who's upset because issues of pregnancy and pregnancy loss were featured in this person's account. And so immediately, without even knowing this person or even knowing the details of the analysis of their data, we know something that perhaps we didn't if I would have just said Daisy, age 19 to 24, having been in recovery. So Photovoice, methodologically, it addresses some of the criticisms that one might have of semi-structured interviews. And I find a lot of benefit in semi-structured interviews, so this is not to critique them as a whole, but like any methodology, any method, they have certain benefits and certain constraints just by virtue of what they are. There is, in most interviews, the researcher sets the agenda of what questions are asked and therefore frames the research, and that can be a very positive thing. But what it does mean is that already there's an agenda there, and we're kind of closing off certain areas of investigation while we're opening up others. This can be a barrier to new insights, particularly if we're working with people who are historically or within research, just their voices haven't been heard very much, and they're unlikely to be researchers in their own right. A lot of interviews can be felt by participants to be challenging to engage with. They might have echoes of other kinds of encounters, like medical interviews or being sat down with teachers where there's a lot of power differentials, and they might feel they're expected to behave in a certain way that is perhaps counter to the dialogue that we want to have with the participant, where we might want them to open up about things that are quite challenging. And because interviews traditionally are verbal, it means that we're asking people to put their experience into words, and that can be really challenging, really difficult. And I think that we all have things that are important to us but would find very difficult to put into words. And so when we're thinking about things like addiction, where it's very complex, such a long period of time and very chaotic, it can be very challenging to represent that in words, and having a way around that can be really useful. So just some kind of practicalities if you wanted to use photo elicitation, inviting people to bring their own photographs to stimulate discussion. There are some additional things that you would have to do. You would want to discuss the research activities in depth with your participants and provide opportunity for questions, because this is probably different from things that they've done before, especially if they've come through medical systems or treatment systems where they would have been interviewed in a different context. You want to set things up as being a bit more empowering, so you start things a little bit differently. Because you're using images and particularly photographs, there are certain legal ethical boundaries around these, such as privacy if somebody else is in the photograph, what might happen to the photographs afterwards. So for our study, people agreed to have us retain these photographs so that we can use them in events like this, and we would blur out identifying details for most people. Certainly people who are not the participant. And then some participants said, I'd like you to use my face, and others said, no, thank you, please blur out my face. So there's these conversations that can happen. And just ensuring the practicalities of these things. There's equipment involved and stuff that there wouldn't necessarily be in most other researchers' encounters. How it works when you're sitting down with someone, well, certainly for us, Ragini, our third speaker today, she led all of these interviews. And we start by saying, is there a photograph you would like to share first? So already kind of turning the stage over to the participant and giving them a lot of control over how they begin things. And from there, there's a narrative of addiction and recovery that's supported by the photographs. So what's happened up until this point is that people have had a chance to get their thoughts together. They've had a chance to think about their lives and what has been a factor in their addiction and in their recovery. They've had a chance to select images that are meaningful to them. And maybe they will talk through these images very clearly and explicitly and make reference to them. Maybe they'll just put them on the table and they're there as a support, perhaps a reminder. But they've had an opportunity to think about this and to decide what story they wish to tell, while keeping it very fresh and vivid in their minds, and had a chance to select images that perhaps speak to the things that they find hard to say, but which they can offer other ways in. right? So it changes the dynamic a lot. And in the interviews, sometimes people really used these images. Sometimes they were just there, but the background work is there. And sometimes people were very verbal, like me. They spoke a lot and they spoke quickly. Sometimes not. But you can see the fruits of this activity in what they are able to say, and sometimes they can point to these images. And so when you have these, then there can be additional prompts. So, asking what were your relationships with other people like? What advice might you give? And even though that's a very general question, what advice would you give to those trying to tackle alcohol and drug use in young people? Because this is grounded in people's lived experience and because they've really thought about this, it tends to be very impactful advice that's not generic, that is really something that can be used and is often quite impassioned. So it can be very, very helpful. To give you a sense of what this looks like in practice, then there's a few different stages. There's the stage that is very participant-led, where you're giving them a lot of opportunities to shape the encounter with a bit of guidance about the general tasks. So, for example, take photos or images that help me to understand what it's like for you to come through recovery, giving them time for that. Then there's the research encounter, where you work through the images together and generate text that normal interview text that you'd be used to working with. And then within the when you're doing the analysis as a researcher, it's really helpful to have this, because sometimes you can go back and forth to the images. The photos help you to communicate with new audiences, and it retains a sense of personhood, that even though this is an anonymized individual, certainly I've never met them, it reminds one that there's still a human being on the other aspect of these concepts that one might be generating. Oops. So let me give you an example of how Photovoice can result in something that looks like a traditional qualitative methods theme. So we have here 3 out of a selection of images that Samar, one of our participants, brought in. And you can see also that here he was happy to have, some people were happy to have their images used. So this is a series of 3 images, a child and then a boy sandwiched between 2 other boys at a train track, right? And at that point, he was actually using drugs and in active addiction. But these relationships were very important to him, so it's very significant to him that he chose this photograph. So there's an element of time here as he's growing up. And then very interestingly, this person brought an image just of an internet meme that he brought in of a caterpillar turning into a butterfly. And it said, "Give yourself time," a transformation from the caterpillar to butterfly. And in analyzing this text and others, this led me to think about structuring a life of recovery as one mechanism of resilience for recovery. That amongst many of the tasks and things that people who are in addiction have to do, they actually have to structure their time actively and adaptively in recovery. So Samar says, in his interview, "I see this recovery as valuable time. I'm not like I'm just passing time with all the things, like just eating, sleeping, keeping away from substances, and that's it, done," right? He says it's not enough to just not use substances. It's not like this. But the new things, the ones that went away in addiction, I have to learn those things too, like how to again build a relationship with someone, how to talk with them. And so this theme, it speaks to the ways in which when one is in addiction, and certainly growing up in young adulthood and childhood in addiction, there are certain things that one doesn't learn how to do, or doesn't learn how to do effectively in forming relationships with other people, certainly healthy relationships. And as well as, working on forgiveness and all of these very important interpersonal things, actually structuring one's day to allow the time for transformation to happen is really important and something that they have to learn. And these images speak to that as much as the text speaks to that. I'll briefly show you some examples of the posters that participants generated. As mentioned, we invited participants to make posters as outward messages for people, and they did that with the support of Ragini, because some people wanted to take a very active role in making those posters, and others really wanted to just kind of direct the action and let her put it together. And that again is a way of empowering people, kind of have them do what they wish to do. So for example, if we look just maybe at the middle one, I want you to understand that addiction is a disease. Be proud and supportive of a person who walks into a rehab center and successfully comes out the other side. And there I have a picture of a watch. So again, time. This is a gift I got from someone who understood and acknowledged my journey of struggle and rewarded me for my successful fight for this disease. It makes me feel proud of myself. I don't know about you, but I look at this and I feel something. I feel an emotion, I feel like I'm seeing someone, and I feel that there was somebody on the other side speaking to me. And that's a very important aspect of public health intervention, is ensuring that actually there's this communication. So it kind of summing things up before we move to an example of why we might want to use visual methods, bringing together some of the things that we talked about, is I hope that in seeing the way that this encounter can work, you might see the ways in which this can empower participants, particularly participants who may be vulnerable or marginalized. So a lot of visual methods are used with people in addiction, certainly, but marginalized groups, people with learning difficulties and severe and learning disabilities, children and young people, sex workers, people living with chronic illnesses, sexual minorities, low-income groups, people who may, for various reasons, be wary of or struggle with other forms of research methods. And it allows them to shape the conversation. Is that not going ahead? There we go. Similarly, it enhances accessibility, right? Because you're not necessarily relying on verbal text, it matters less if people are highly educated or able to speak with eloquence, because they can use these tools to help communicate and to share their story as well. So where there's different languages being spoken or different levels of education, this is really helpful. And it allows us to broaden our forms of knowledge to things that are actually quite embodied, such as the experience of addiction, which is a body experience, and also relationships, perhaps, being able to show how you think other people see you. Because it adds this other layer above text, it enhances the richness of the data. So I mentioned that sometimes people then are able to use this to speak with more detail, and that happens. And we also have this additional form of data that we can use directly and access. Have here another example of a poster to reflect on. Other reasons why we use visual methods, it's a rewarding process. Creativity often tends to be rewarding, and many of our participants said that they felt that this was a rewarding process for them. They felt listened to. They felt they were able to tell their story in a way that perhaps they hadn't before. And these are people who have been through recovery centers where they tell their addiction stories a lot. So there's something special and different that can happen here. And it enhances voice in the ways that we've seen. I hope you feel, as I feel, that our participants have been with us in some way in speaking about this. And it's also very adaptable for different cultural practices. Photovoice and photoelicitation is used a lot because photographs work really well for a lot of different people. And nowadays, it doesn't take too much in the way of resources. You can use anything. You can use storytelling. You can use different kind of visual forms that are specific to different cultures and different communities. And ultimately, this helps us to reveal new insight.